Hi, I'm Nicola Tallis, author of Uncrowned Queen, the latest biography of Margaret Beaufort, someone who quite often inspires a reaction in people, and obviously who I'm going to be talking to you about today. I'm sure you can appreciate it's quite difficult trying to condense somebody's life down into 15 minutes. So hopefully this will leave you wanting to find out more about her and will perhaps encourage you to go away and read my book. Margaret was born on the 31st of May 1443 at Bletsoe Castle, the daughter of John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, and his wife, Margaret Beauchamp. But John Beaufort was no ordinary duke because, as the grandson of John of Gaunt, himself the third surviving son of Edward III, he, and therefore also Margaret, had royal blood in their veins. Very sadly, Margaret was never to be given the opportunity to get to know her father because she was just a few days shy of her first birthday when John Beaufort died, possibly at his own hand, as a result of a dismal French military campaign that had ended in his disgrace. As his only legitimate child, Margaret became a wealthy heiress and thus began a period of her life when she would be used as a pawn in the power struggles of ambitious men. Just a few days after her father's death, on her first birthday in fact, Margaret became the ward of Henry VI's great favourite, William de la Pole, Earl and then Duke of Suffolk, and she was betrothed to his son. In 1450, when the youngsters were just 6 years old, they underwent some kind of marriage ceremony of words only, but 3 years later this was dissolved. Instead, Henry VI, who was also Margaret's kinsman by blood, had found a more appropriate match for Margaret, and the candidate that he had in mind for her was his own half-brother, Edmund Tudor. The marriage didn't take place immediately, and it wasn't until sometime shortly after Margaret's 12th birthday on the 31st of May 1455, which was just 9 days after the First Battle of St Albans that marked the beginning of the Wars of the Roses, that Margaret and Edmund were married. Immediately, Edmund determined to make Margaret his wife in the fullest sense of the word, and the marriage was immediately consummated. Within a very short space of time, Margaret became pregnant, but she was thrown into a hugely precarious situation when her husband died in November 1456, almost certainly of the plague, leaving Margaret alone and pregnant and vulnerable. Fortunately for her, her brother-in-law Jasper Tudor came to her aid, conveying her to his stronghold at Pembroke Castle, and it was here that on the 28th of January 1457, 13-year-old Margaret gave birth to a son. It had nevertheless been an extremely traumatic and difficult experience for her, and her friend and confessor Bishop Fisher would later recall that it seemed a miracle that at that age and of so little a personage, anyone should have been born at all. Margaret's son was named Henry in honour of his kinsman, Henry VI, and he was, from the moment of his birth, an extraordinary bond between mother and son was forged, one that would endure for the rest of their lives, perhaps later heightened by the knowledge that, whether through chance or design, Henry was to be Margaret's only child. Even though she was just 13, Margaret recognised the importance of remarrying and taking a protector to ensure her own interests and those of her son. And so she made the decision to marry Henry Stafford, who was the second son of the Duke of Buckingham. And the marriage took place almost a year after Henry Tudor's birth in January 1458. We can certainly say that in personal terms, Margaret's marriage to Henry Stafford was the most successful of her marriages, and she and Stafford seem to have had a genuine affection for one another. But let's not forget, she was still just 13 years old at this time. She was also living in extremely uncertain times. So in 1461, Henry VI was deposed and Edward IV declared king in his stead. And this would have profound consequences for Margaret and her family. Her son Henry was taken to live at Raglan Castle as the ward of as the ward of Edward IV's friend and supporter, William Herbert. And though Margaret was fortunate enough to be able to keep in touch with her son, she spent very little time with him. We know that she visited him at Raglan on at least one occasion, but the separation must still have been very difficult for her. In 1469, however, Herbert was killed at the Battle of Edgecote, a battle at which Henry Tudor had also been present. Much to Margaret's relief, she learnt that her son was safe and hadn't been injured or killed at the battle. Mother and son were afforded a brief opportunity to spend some time together the following year when Henry VI was briefly restored to the throne. But everything changed in 1471. In April and May, Edward IV won 2 decisive victories at Barnet and Tewkesbury, both of which were to have dire consequences for Margaret. Her husband Stafford, who'd fought for Edward IV at Barnet, was badly injured, and following Tewkesbury, Jasper and Henry Tudor fled abroad, some sources say at Margaret's urging. Though aiming for France, they landed in Brittany, where they became the hostages of Francis II. Back in England, on the 21st of May, Henry VI was murdered at the Tower of London, and as his son and heir had been killed at Tewkesbury, this effectively wiped out all of the Lancastrian male figureheads. As if the death of her kinsman and the exile of her son weren't enough for her to contend with, on the 4th of October, Margaret's husband Stafford died, possibly as a result of the injuries he'd earlier inflicted at Barnet. Less than a year after his death, in June 1472, Margaret married for the 4th time. Though she wasn't obliged to remarry, she recognised that she was in a precarious situation. With no protector, her family allegiances and her son's exile made them both vulnerable. So this time it was essential that she should choose a husband who had strong links with the House of York, coupled with the ability to use these to the advantage of Margaret and her son. Her choice fell on Thomas Stanley, who was a member of Edward IV's household. Stanley's presence was often required at court, and as the 1470s progressed, Margaret too became an increasing presence there. Meanwhile, though her son remained in exile, Margaret made attempts to secure his return home, and she came close to effecting a reconciliation. So close, in fact, that Edward IV drafted a pardon. But her hopes were cruelly thwarted when Edward died unexpectedly in April 1483, throwing Henry's fate into uncertainty. Within a matter of weeks, Edward's own son had been deposed and his brother declared Richard III in his stead. Edward's 2 sons, popularly remembered as the princes in the Tower, were never seen again. If you want to know what my thoughts are on Margaret's role in their disappearance, then you will, of course, have to read the book. But what is clear is that within a short space of time, Margaret became involved in a plot against Richard III with the Duke of Buckingham. However, the plot, known as the Buckingham Rebellion, all went badly wrong. Buckingham was executed. Margaret's son, who'd set sail from Brittany, was forced to return back. But for Margaret, there was nowhere to go. Though Richard was well aware of her complicity, she was spared the death penalty, but her lands and property were taken from her and she was placed under house imprisonment under the custodianship of her husband. None of this was enough to deter Margaret from her plotting, and by the summer of 1485, her son Henry was ready to invade England. Having landed at Milford Haven, on the 22nd of August, he confronted Richard's forces at Bosworth in Leicestershire. And though the odds had been stacked very much in Richard's favour, Henry succeeded in defeating Richard's forces and he was killed. Henry was now King of England and the first of the Tudor kings. The effects of Henry's victory at Bosworth had profound consequences for Margaret. She quickly established herself as the leading lady of the realm, and for the first decade of her son's reign, she was an almost constant presence at his court. Apartments were set aside in each of the royal palaces for her use, sometimes with interconnecting chambers between her rooms and Henry's. But whether this was the case or not, they were always close to those of the king. She was also always at the forefront of court ceremonial and often wore her coronet on public occasions, reportedly walking just half a pace behind Henry's queen, Elizabeth of York. Such was the demeanour of the woman who behaved as though she were an uncrowned queen. But Margaret was also a woman who loved to have a good time, and among her accounts, payments can be found for some Spaniards who danced the Morris, a child who played a song for her, and for her 2 fools, one of whom was named Skip. Margaret was also fond of cards, and in later life she once sent a man to Buckden to deputise for her on a pilgrimage whilst she played. Likewise, she enjoyed both chess and gambling and was also known to place bets on the outcomes of games of chess. But Margaret was also able to use her wealth and position to do much good to those who were less fortunate. And amongst other things, she founded almshouses, gave money and clothes to the poor, and on one occasion she even paid the debts of a priest who was in jail. Likewise, she's also well known for the founding of 2 Cambridge colleges. Scholarship had always been a passion of hers, and with her wealth, this really enabled her to indulge it for the benefit of others. Christ's was founded in 1505, while St John's was founded in 1511, 2 years after Margaret's death. Both are still fully working, functioning colleges. Margaret's greatest love was her family, and she took a great interest in her grandchildren, 4 of whom survived infancy. She wept with joy on the 14th of November 1501 as she watched her eldest grandson, Prince Arthur, exchange wedding vows with the Spanish princess Catherine of Aragon, and would undoubtedly have been heartbroken when just 5 months after the wedding, Arthur died in 1502. The following year, Elizabeth of York also died, plunging the royal family into mourning. Unfortunately, death was to be a common theme for the later years of Margaret's life, and in early 1509 it became clear that the life of her son was also ebbing away. On the 21st of April, Henry VII died, leaving Margaret utterly devastated. Sorry, the 21st of April, I think I just said that. Margaret's teenage grandson, who was just a couple of months short of his 18th birthday, succeeded his father. In June, Henry married his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon, and later that month the couple were crowned in Westminster Abbey. Though Margaret partook in the traditional coronation banquet in Westminster Hall, she no longer had the energy for such entertainments, and indeed the coronation transpired to be the last occasion on which she would ever see her grandson. Immediately after, she retired to the abbot's house within Westminster Abbey. By now, she was gravely ill and becoming weaker by the day. On the 29th of June, the day after her grandson's 18th birthday, she slipped quietly into death at the age of 66, an occasion for which her confessor and friend Bishop Fisher remarked that all England had cause for weeping. As she'd instructed, Margaret was buried in the magnificent Lady Chapel within Westminster Abbey, where the Florentine sculptor Pietro Torrigiano created her tomb. Margaret's legacy was both enduring and worthy of celebration. She'd used her wealth and position to help improve the lives of others, her values being wrought in the stones of the Cambridge colleges she'd founded and supported. Moreover, she'd not only survived all of the obstacles that life had thrown at her and that could well have left her broken, she had thrived. She left behind her a dynasty that would be the most talked of in British history, whose foundations she had striven to instil, risking her life in the process. Even more significantly, her bloodline endures to this day, for every English monarch since 1509 and every British monarch since 1603, including our present Queen Elizabeth II, has been able to trace their descent from Margaret. It is a fitting and enduring legacy for the woman who'd striven so hard to achieve and keep a crown for her family. Thank you very much.